Well, welcome to this conversation. I'm Cathy Hird. I'm a retired United Church minister. I met Maggie in 1996. She was beginning her training for ordination, and I went to work with her at Cape Croker for 2 years. I had a wonderful introduction into Anishinaabe culture and story through Maggie. She's been an important part of my journey and learning.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Cathy. My name is Maggie Dieter. I am a United Church minister currently serving at New Hamburg, just outside of Kitchener. And before that, I served a number of years, 9.5 years at the General Council office, serving in the Indigenous Justice, Indigenous Ministries unit as their executive minister. That after leaving the Saugeen Ojibwe territory, serving that area for 15 years. And Cathy was a wonderful companion as I started my journey in ministry, grounding me and giving me wonderful guidance. It's good to be with you today and good to have this conversation with you.
You were one of the first people who came to mind for me when I heard about the Remit, which is the reason for this conversation. First of all, it's a category 3 remit. If you don't vote, it counts as a no. Category 3 remits are really hard to get past. And so I really wanted to make sure that we provided congregations with as much information as we could. Mm-hmm. And the remit came as a response to the National Indigenous Council's request that the National Church identify and then remove the structural barriers. The purpose of the remit is to remove those barriers in the way that the Indigenous Church wants to, so that the Indigenous Church would have the freedom to develop structures that work for the Indigenous Church.
Mm-hmm. In that is also the intention then to continue to develop new relationships, to create a new relationship that rather in place of mission to Indians, partnership in God's creation to all the earth. So we're talking about structures and processes, but also relationships. So emerging relationships of what I recall the Indigenous Council relationships built on equity, respect, and mutuality. So, and those conversations, of course, we know, Cathy, have been going on for decades, and there's been a movement within our church for several years. So this is not something new. This is yet another step along the way.
And I was aware of that. I know something of that story. But not everyone would. And so telling that story is part of why we said, yeah, let's have this conversation. I remember being at the first regional gathering for Western Ontario Waterways, which is where I'm based, and suddenly realizing that the All Native Circle Conference was gone, and the National Indigenous Council and the Council of Elders did exist, but the structure wasn't there. And I felt this, oh my goodness, we've taken apart what the Indigenous Church had built, and we don't yet have something else in place. And this isn't the first time that we took apart structure without the Indigenous Church being part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, structures were taken apart with the change in the from conferences to regions and removing that level. The Indigenous Church was impacted. There was a lot of grief, and my sense is likely still a lot of grief. The All Native Circle Conference was formed in the 80s. One of the structures that emerged, or needs that emerged from the conversation. And it's true, by the time the regions emerged and met, the Indigenous Church was still not clearly defined. And at the time that whole restructuring happened, there was that tension because the Indigenous church timelines were quite different than the wider church's timelines, and our conversations in a sense were just beginning with the calls to the church. The timelines and the ways in which we engage community is so different that the times didn't align, so development wasn't there, but there was a lot of background work to be done, and I think it caught my sense is, well, with any transition, but this in particular because it was such a major shift, just caused that tension and the grief and all that comes with that. So it was a difficult time. There was a sense that where is the Indigenous church? Where are our representatives? And that new relationship hadn't been clarified or understood yet.
In 1925, when union happened, the Indigenous churches got plunked into the United Church. It was a change that my settler church did, and then and imposed on the Indigenous congregations. And then we did it again. We did it in the late 60s, early 70s with, sure, we were modernizing the United Church's structure, but we got rid of the Home Mission Board, which is where the Indigenous church knew they belonged. And suddenly that was gone. And the funding model changed completely. People had to figure out a whole new structure. It feels like we just keep imposing the change that the settler church thinks that it needs. And this remit will say, we're not imposing anymore. This time, you get to choose the structures.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something essential, and that's recognizing that the church has been colonizing and has contributed to this country's colonization of Indigenous peoples, and so there just wasn't that awareness, that dialogue in 1925. Indigenous voices, have emerged or began to emerge, even before the 80s. Things were happening within Indigenous communities and even nationally that really sparked conversations around, Indigenous communities, Indigenous people finding their own way and self-determining and developing their own ways of being. I mean, just to think about all of the heavy lifting that our predecessors, like Indigenous leaders, have done, to even get us to this point. I think there wasn't that awareness. There have been a number of events, reports that have happened over the decades that have helped the church increasingly becoming aware of the colonizing history, and that it needs to change. We need a new relationship. So it's been a journey. It certainly has been a journey, and we're unlearning, we're unsettling. And that takes time because it's a deep transformation. It's right into the fabric of Canada, and right into the fabric of our church. So it takes a lot of unraveling and time to do.
You mentioned the 80s a couple of times, and that is a bit of history that I hope the wider church does pay attention to, because Stan McKay, when he was working for the Division of Mission in Canada, began these series of consultations. Those were opportunities for people from across the country to gather, Indigenous people from across the country to gather and talk about what they needed. My first husband was the minister at Ganawage, and so was participating in the consultations. He was inside, part of the conversation, and I was sitting outside in the sun reading a book. And just I would join them for lunch and heard a little bit about what was going on, and just stayed outside. And that memory came to me as I looked at the remit, because I trust that there will be conversation that happens inside between Indigenous people, and I will be sitting outside of that. And that's okay. There will be time for relationship and conversation together, but it's okay to have that conversation happening among the people who are affected. And as the Indigenous Church figures out how to embody their relationship to each other and to the wider church.
That time was a real turning point when Indigenous community said, we need to have our own conversations. There have been years and years and years, hundreds of years of oppression and exclusion and silencing of voices that the indigenous peoples were saying, no, we're going to use our voice. And I think, to strengthen our voice, in the context of our own community, that's part of strengthening and healing who we are after years of not being at the table and not having a place to practice and strengthen our voice. And it is ours to have. I mean, it is our God-given voice. And I think about the apology. The church recognized that they didn't see what they were doing and did not recognize the value and the richness that was already present in Indigenous people. And so therefore, we're all impoverished because of that. So at the turn, in the 80s, when that movement started to really strengthen, it really began. New things began to emerge, and I think it's important that we remember that truth telling and transformation, especially in the context of our faith, is this essential part to getting to where we need to for new life and for new relationship. Reconciliation or transformation or right relations is not only about creating new processes and structures, especially in the church. We have to think about transformation of our hearts and why we're doing this in the first place, to understand it, at some level here, but at another level right here. I think that's the big journey, is connecting the two. And it was an elder at Cape Croker that taught me that the longest journey, is from here to our hearts. Yeah.
There are some structures that need to be done, and that needs to be done appropriately by the Indigenous Church, but there also needs to be dialogue. The settler church needs to understand what those structures are like, and what they are, and why they are designed the way they are. And that only happens if we talk. So we need to keep talking about the why and the history and the rootedness of who we become.
We're still learning about time in this whole process. It's the Kairos time, and the calls to the church mention that it can't be that Chronos time, because there's two different worldviews about time when you look at Indigenous community and settler community. And so there's going to be a clash, and it's going to take more time. It's going to take more conversation, and maybe I'm hoping. We don't know, which way this remit will go, but I'm hoping that this will be a time in the church where we re-engage in this conversation about truth telling, about about the history of the church and where we've come from and where we want to go. And so, dialogue, like you say, it's so essential. Talk to each other. We sort of have to reason things out together and struggle together and celebrate together. One hope is that I know that the Indigenous Church meets this summer for their National Indigenous Spiritual Gathering. It'll be their first since 2019. It'll be good to hear from them and what they have to say, about the remit. So their leadership, their voice is important as well. I know this is the work of the wider church, of the settler church, and it is true, the work of decolonizing is, but we are also decolonizing within our Indigenous communities. And so it's important that we hear the voice, that we hear the wisdom and some direction. I have some wonderful words to share as we close.
Yes.
And I hadn't visited these words in a while, and I come across them, thinking about our conversation today. And these words belong to the elder Edith Memnock. She was a representative that met at a meeting in 1988, representative of the All Native Circle Conference, an elder. And this was in response to the 1986 apology to Indigenous peoples. So she offered these words to the church. We only ask of you to respect our sacred fire, the creation, and to live in peaceful coexistence with us. We recognize the hurts and feelings will continue amongst our people, but through partnership and walking hand in hand, the Indian spirit will eventually heal. Through our love, understanding, and sincerity, the brotherhood and sisterhood of unity, strength, and respect can be achieved. The people hope and pray that the apology is not symbolic, but that these are the words of action and sincerity. We appreciate the freedom for culture and religious expression. In the new spirit this apology has created, let us unite our hearts and minds in the wholeness of life that the Great Spirit has given us. And may it be so.
Greetings. My name is Therese Samuel. I use the pronouns she and her, and I serve as Minister for Right Relations and Social Justice for Antler River Watershed, Horseshoe Falls, and Western Ontario Waterways Regional Councils. I offer some background information to help prepare regional councils and pastoral charge governing bodies to discuss the remit for restructuring of the Indigenous Church. From March 15th, 2023 through March 31st, 2024, every regional council and every pastoral charge governing body, that's the board or council, is being asked to approve an amendment to the basis of union authorizing an autonomous Indigenous church structure. This presentation offers an overview of the Doctrine of Discovery, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, the caretaker's calls to the church, the proposals that led to the remit, and the remit itself. For you, this may be a review or new information, or a little bit of both. It will give a common starting point to discuss the remit. Links to the documents and more information accompany this presentation. We begin with the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is not one document, but is a set of what are called papal bulls, starting in the mid-1400s. Papal bulls were declarations made by popes. The Doctrine of Discovery was a basis of colonization of many lands by European nations. According to this doctrine, if explorers found land that was not inhabited by Christians, it was considered empty, and the explorers could take over the lands. Non-Christian people living there could be made Christian or enslaved or even killed. It combined legal language and Christian terminology and became a basis of international law and laws of many colonizing nations, including Canada. In Canada, the Indian Act, residential schools, and the 60s Scoop are some of the outcomes of this belief system. The United Church of Canada officially repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery in March of 2012, denouncing the Doctrine of Discovery as fundamentally opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ and a violation of the inherent human rights that all individuals and peoples have received from God. However, repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery is just a first action. It continues to have a lasting impact through past and current laws and practices in the nation and in the church. The United Church continues to work to live into the repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery. So let's look at 3 documents toward decolonization. From the United Nations, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. From Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the calls to action, and from Indigenous leaders within the United Church of Canada, the caretaker's calls to the church. Starting with the United Nations Declaration. This is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, sometimes referred to as UNDRIP, or the UN Declaration. In 2007, after more than 20 years of consultation between Indigenous peoples and nation-states, the United Nations approved this declaration, but it was opposed by Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. In 2010, Canada endorsed the UN Declaration as an aspirational document but did not implement it. In 2017, Canada became a full supporter of the declaration, and in 2021, Canada passed into law the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, UNDRIPA. This act drew a mix of approval and disapproval from Indigenous groups, but it is what Canada has now as a roadmap for implementing the declaration. The UN Declaration has 46 articles organized around 6 key principles: the right to self-determination, to participate in decision-making, to cultural and spiritual identity, to lands and resources, to free, prior, and informed consent, and to freedom from discrimination. Next, the TRC calls to action. TRC stands for Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it came about from the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement of 2006. That was the legal settlement between residential school survivors, the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit representatives, and the parties that created and operated the schools, including the United Church of Canada. In events held by the TRC, many deep and painful truths were shared by survivors, families, communities, and others who were affected by the residential schools. In 2015, the Commission released their summary report, which includes 94 calls to action. These calls to action are statements calling for specific actions toward reconciliation by the Canadian government, the church parties to the settlement, including the United Church of Canada, and other sectors of society. And I'd like to highlight one particular call to action, number 48, a call to adopting and complying with the principles, norms, and standards of the UN Declaration, which, among other things, includes respecting Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination in spiritual matters. In 2016, the United Church of Canada expressed a commitment to honoring call to action number 48. The Indigenous Church, along with the non-Indigenous settler church, began a process of consultation to determine the vision and future structure of the Indigenous Church. And this brings us to the caretakers' calls to the church. Now, when you hear calls to the church, know that this is a United Church document, often confused with the TRC calls to action relating to the churches, but it refers to the caretakers' calls to the church, which contains the Indigenous Church's vision for the Indigenous people's ministry and communities of faith within the United Church of Canada. It was written by the caretakers of our Indigenous Circle, who were Indigenous leaders from across the United Church of Canada. It was affirmed by the broader Indigenous Church at the National Aboriginal Spiritual Gathering in 2017 and accepted for implementation by General Council 43 in 2018. Calls to the Church is foundational to the relationship between the Indigenous Church and the rest of the United Church of Canada. The broader Indigenous Church held a series of gatherings in Indigenous communities, and at the 2019 National Indigenous Spiritual Gathering developed a proposal to General Council regarding the current status of the National Indigenous Council and plans for future structure. That proposal was passed by General Council 43 in October of 2019. And that brings us to the proposals that led to the remit. These proposals were brought to the 44th General Council, which met between February and July of 2022. In NIC 01, the National Indigenous Council proposed that the 44th General Council act on the issue of autonomy of the Indigenous Church by directing the General Secretary to identify and remove all the structural barriers to developing and sustaining an autonomous Indigenous Church within the United Church of Canada, consistent with the caretakers' calls to the Church and the UN Declaration, and to continue the conversation of restructuring right relations and reparations with the National Indigenous Circle. In response, the General Secretary presented GS-10, Living into Reconciliation, proposing that the General Council authorize a Category 3 remit to approve a new structure of the Indigenous Church within the United Church and relationship to the settler church to be determined by the Indigenous Church in its own time and through its own processes within the framework of the calls to the church and without the need for further remit approval. And approve shortening the time for study and information sharing for regional councils and pastoral charges from the usual 24 months to 12 months for this remit. Both proposals passed, and here is the remit question. Does the regional council or pastoral charge agree to amend the basis of union to reflect that the United Church of Canada will be organized as follows: a 3-council structure consisting of communities of faith, regional councils, and a denominational council, and an autonomous national Indigenous organization. And that once the new autonomous national Indigenous organization is established within the United Church of Canada, it will have its own mechanisms to make any future changes to its structure and processes, and therefore will not be subject to the remit process, and to reflect the changes required for the establishment of the autonomous national Indigenous organization. So, this remit, if passed, will be movement on the path of living into call to action number 48 in respecting Indigenous people's right to self-determination. About the remit process, it is a Category 3 remit because it will significantly change a structure of the church. We heard earlier that Category 3 remits can be hard to pass, and that is because in order to pass, they must be approved by a majority of regional councils and pastoral charge governing bodies, and it takes work to get enough pastoral charges to vote. If any regional council or pastoral charge does not send in a vote, it will be registered as a no vote. Links to documents and further information accompany this presentation. The remit study materials and response forms for your pastoral charges governing body to send in are available on the General Council 44 website, www.generalcouncil44.ca. Remember, the vote of the governing body of each pastoral charge must be received by March 31st, 2024.
Ani Bojo. My name is Martha Pedoniquotte, and I am from the Chippewas of Nawash, Neashingaming at Cape Croker on the Bruce Peninsula. I am currently working for the National Indigenous Council, Indigenous Ministries and Justice Unit as a Community Capacity Development Coordinator, CCDC for short. I work for the Ontario-Quebec East region, and there are currently 3 CCDCs working, with one in the Keewatin area, who is Ray Anderson, and Charlene Burns, who does the west of Canada, Western Canada. We are responsible for building capacity within the Indigenous communities of faith and to have the working relationship with the National Indigenous Council and their advisory groups, general council staff, and all regional councils and their networks. We also work with urban and off-reserve Indigenous people and the Indigenous Office of Vocation and Theological Schools. I'm currently responsible for 24 communities of faith in Ontario and Quebec, but my area expands from southwestern Ontario to the eastern part of Canada. And Ray, who's Keewatin, takes care of northern Ontario. The remit is to remove the barriers for Indigenous people to be a self-determining church. A lot of Indigenous communities that were raised within the United Church still love the church and still want to be a part of the church, but they want to also explore who they are as Indigenous people, because that was taken away from them with residential school and colonization. We want to be in relationship with the non-Indigenous church, but we also want to explore who we are as Indigenous people. So learning our own spirituality on a parallel path with the United Church. So the remit gives us that opportunity to do that, but still stay a part of the United Church. We're asking for autonomy, not separation. And by allowing the remit to go forward, we have the opportunity to explore that and to bring back who we want to be and how we want to be in relationship with the broader church. So in closing, I would just like to say that regardless of the outcome of the remit in 2024, I hope that relationships are still built upon within the United Church, and that people continue to learn about the struggles that Indigenous people have had intergenerationally. We all have a lot of healing to do, and I believe this can only be achieved through our faith and spirituality, however that may look in each individual's lives. Miigwech.